Okay, the genuinely funny things about 1947. Let me make a proper accounting. I've been thinking about this since I sat down this morning and started warming up and doing my exercises, because when you're lying on a cold wooden floor doing breathing exercises for a monologue you're working on, your mind wanders in productive directions. Here is my list. The telephone situation. I have a telephone. It is on the wall of my kitchen. It is black and heavy. Heavy in a way that I believe is a design choice intended to convey seriousness, to communicate that this device is not a toy. This device is for important communication, not frivolity. When it rings with a sound that suggests something urgent is happening somewhere, even when what's happening is Mrs. Caruso from the third floor wanting to know if I have sugar to spare. When I pick it up, there is a brief moment, sometimes very brief, sometimes less brief, where I wait for the operator. The operator. There is a person, a woman usually, a specific woman whose voice I now know quite well, whose name I believe is Helen, based on what I've heard her called by other people on the line, who connects my calls. Every single call. I pick up the phone. I tell Helen where I want to go, and Helen connects me. Helen has, in my estimation, heard approximately every conversation I've had on the telephone for the last 3 years. Helen knows about the auditions. Helen knows about Harriet. Helen knows about Jack. Helen knows about everything, because Helen is the bridge between me and everyone I communicate with by phone, and Helen does her job with complete professionalism and total silence on the matter. And I feel sometimes that I owe Helen a card at Christmas, at minimum. I imagine the conversations Helen could tell. I imagine Helen sitting at her switchboard with her headset on, connecting the city to itself, knowing everything, saying nothing, developing an incredibly detailed picture of the interior lives of everyone in her section of Manhattan. I imagine Helen going home at the end of her shift and her husband asking how her day was, and Helen saying, "Fine," because what she actually knows would take 3 weeks to tell, and also is, technically, private. Helen is, in my imagination, one of the most interesting women in New York. The cigarettes. I smoke. I've mentioned this. Cigarettes are, and I want to say this with the appropriate context, everywhere. In 1947, cigarettes are not a vice. They are a lifestyle accessory. They are a conversational tool. They are, in the literature, films, and general cultural consensus of this moment, things that sophisticated people do. Full stop. My doctor smokes. He smokes in his office. While he is examining me, he once put a cigarette down on the edge of his desk, mid-examination, to write something in my file, and picked it back up when he was done, like this was a completely natural sequence of events. Which, in 1947, it is. It completely is. Jack smokes. Harriet smokes. The director at the auditions smokes. Rita at Manny's smokes, though she has the decency to do it behind the counter. The man in the gray suit at Manny's smokes. The 2 girls in the back booth smoke. The conductor on the subway platform was smoking this morning, which I believe is technically not permitted, but nobody had told him or he had declined to receive the information. I smoke Chesterfields. This is partly preference, and partly because the advertising for Chesterfields has recently begun to involve doctors recommending them, and I find this hilarious in a way I cannot entirely explain. A doctor, in an advertisement, recommending cigarettes. This is happening. This is a real advertisement that I see on billboards and in magazines with some regularity. The tagline involves words like mild and satisfying, and what I can only describe as a general air of medical endorsement. I believe, somewhere in the part of me that knows things before I can explain them, the same part that knows the street will be different someday, that at some point in the future, this will seem extraordinary. That people will look back at the doctor recommending cigarettes billboard and feel something between bewilderment and horror. But today it's Tuesday, and my Chesterfield is very mild and satisfying, and the doctor says it's fine. Let me tell you about the television. 3 people in my building have televisions. 3 out of 14 apartments. This is considered, in the building, a form of social stratification. You know who has the television. You have been invited to watch the television. Or you have not, and the invitation says something. I have been invited. The television belongs to the Kozlowskis on the 2nd floor, who are a cheerful and generous couple who bought the television in September and have not quite recovered from the marvel of it. Mr. Kozlowski told me, with the reverence of a man describing a religious experience, that you can watch Milton Berle on Tuesday nights, and it is like Milton Berle is in your living room. I told him that Milton Berle in my living room on a Tuesday night sounded like a lot, but that I appreciated the sentiment. The television is a box. I want to be accurate about this. It is a box, roughly the size of a piece of luggage, with a screen on the front that is approximately the size of a legal pad. The picture on the screen is an image. It is identifiable as an image. It is black and white in a way that is several degrees less resolved than black and white in film. More like a gray and slightly less gray situation. An image that is present and moving and recognizable as human beings doing things, but that requires, occasionally, generosity of interpretation on the viewer's part. And yet the whole building knows when the Kozlowskis have their Tuesday guests. And there is something real about it, something genuinely new about it. The idea that a moving picture can come into your home, can live there, can be on when you turn it on, and off when you don't. The idea of that relationship, the image in your own room, in your own chair, at whatever hour you choose. I find it interesting. I am reserving judgment on what it will become, because anything this new contains multitudes of possibility, and I'm not in the habit of deciding what something is before it's had a chance to become it. But I do think, if this thing, this gray and slightly less gray box in the Kozlowskis' living room, if this thing becomes what the part of me that sees ahead thinks it might become, then the whole world changes. Then the woman in the box and the woman watching are in a new kind of relationship, one that nobody has words for yet. I find that interesting. I find that worth watching. Let me tell you about Jack and Tuesday specifically. Jack has a relationship with Tuesdays that I find, from close observation, to be one of the more human things about him. Which is saying something, because Jack is, for all his carefully maintained appearance of being above the fray, one of the more transparently human people I know. Jack hates Tuesdays. Not with drama, not with the performative anguish of a man who makes his suffering available to others, with the quiet, private, well-managed hatred of a man who has identified the source of a recurring irritation and made his peace with it, while fully retaining the irritation. He told me why once. He said, "Tuesday is the day the trades come out." The trades, the industry publications, the papers that track what's opening, what's closing, who's been cast in what, who passed on what picture made what money last weekend. In this industry, the trades are the scoreboard. They are the weekly accounting of who is ascending and who is not, told in the specific language of show business, which is the language of success and euphemism and occasional brutal clarity. Jack used to be in the trades regularly. Then he was in them occasionally. Now he's in them rarely, and the rarely has a specific quality. He appears when something of note occurs, a good role in a solid production, something that reminds the industry that Jack Morrow exists and is worth the trade space. He reads them every Tuesday. He reads them the way a man reads something he's given himself permission to be objective about, but hasn't quite gotten there yet. He reads them with his coffee and his cigarette, and a facial expression that starts very neutral and ends at something only slightly different from very neutral, which is, in Jack, the equivalent of a full display of feeling. Last Tuesday, he called me after the trades. He said, "You see the piece on the new production at the Majestic?" I said, "I saw it." He said, "The lead is Morrison." Morrison is an actor Jack's age who has been doing well, who has the kind of ascending trajectory that Jack's had a lateral version of for the past several years. I said, "I know." He said, "Good for him." And then there was a pause. And in that pause was everything Jack doesn't say, which is a great deal, which is, in some ways, the most important conversation I have with Jack, the one between the words. I said, "Come to Manny's." He said, "It's Tuesday." I said, "Manny's doesn't care what day it is." He came to Manny's. We drank coffee for an hour. He talked about a role he was reading for at a smaller theater on the West Side, a new play, a part that was smaller than what he was used to, but that he described, with the careful specificity he uses when something actually interests him, as the kind of small that does real work. By the end of the second cup, the trades were in the past and the role was in the present, and Jack was himself again, which is to say he was sharp and funny and occasionally devastating in the things he said about human nature. I love Jack most on the Tuesday after he reads the trades, because the Tuesday after the trades is when he's the most honest, when the performance of having made peace with things peels back slightly, and underneath it, you can see the man who wanted the thing and didn't get it and got up the next morning anyway. That man is more interesting than the smooth version. That man I want to know. I'm going to tell you something I haven't told many people, which is that I almost didn't come to New York. I know. Stay with me. I was born in this city. I grew up in this city. The city is in my blood in a literal, cellular sense. But when I was 17 and the question of what came next had to be answered, I had a moment. One specific Tuesday, actually, which perhaps explains my complicated feelings about the day, when I almost chose differently. There was a boy. His name was... Actually, his name doesn't matter. He was from Connecticut. He was nice. He was the kind of nice that at 17 looks like everything you could want, and at 32 you understand was simply the beginning of a vocabulary, not the whole language. He wanted to go back to Connecticut. He wanted to go back to Connecticut and do the thing that Connecticut boys do, which is to get a job and get married and have the specific suburban life that was being held out to my generation, to everyone's generation, as the destination. The picture in the magazine, the house with the yard, the matching set. He asked me to come with him. I was 17. I thought about it for, and this is true, I have checked the memory, approximately 4 minutes. And then I said, "I don't think Connecticut is where I'm going." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to find out." He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he almost but didn't quite speak, which I suppose I had. He went to Connecticut. I assume he got the house. I assume it's very nice. I hope he's happy. I genuinely do. He was a perfectly decent person, and Connecticut is a perfectly decent place, and the life in the magazine is not a lie. It is simply not a complete sentence for every person. It is not a complete sentence for me. The complete sentence for me is this city, and this room, and the audition on Thursday, and the coffee at Manny's, and Jack's face on the Tuesday after the trades, and the woman in the gray coat who stood on 6th Avenue and tilted her face up at the sky. That's the sentence. I'm still writing it. Most of it isn't written yet. That's the part I like best. Let me tell you what I'm working on in here. The monologue is from a play called The Distance Between. The playwright is a woman named Clara Marsh. She is 28 years old. She has written 3 plays, 2 of which were produced in small theaters downtown, and one of which ran for 3 weeks at a slightly larger theater in the village before the producer ran out of money, which is the traditional ending to productions in the village. Not because the work isn't good, but because money in the arts is, it's weather. It comes and goes without particular regard to what deserves it. Clara's work has a quality that I've been trying, for 6 weeks of working on this monologue, to put my finger on. The quality is this. It makes you feel that the character on the stage is a complete person in a way that extends beyond the edges of the stage. That she exists before the curtain goes up and after it comes down. That the play is a window into a life, not the life itself. That's hard to write. That takes, specifically, not writing too much, leaving the air around the words so the person can breathe in the air. Most playwrights write too much. They fill in all the space and then wonder why the characters seem thin. Clara writes exactly enough. It's infuriating and extraordinary. The monologue I'm working on is about waiting. Not about waiting the way most writing about waiting is. Not the obvious waiting, the dramatic waiting, the waiting for the letter or the man or the resolution. This is about the other kind of waiting. The waiting you do while you're busy doing other things. The waiting that isn't the main event of your life, but is somehow always happening underneath everything else. The character says at one point, "I've been waiting so long, I can't always tell when I'm waiting anymore. It just feels like Tuesday." I love that line. I love it because it's funny and true at the same time, which is the hardest combination. The one you can reach for your whole career and only occasionally grab. And I love it because it sounds like something a real person would actually say, not something a character says to let the audience know what she's feeling. She's not explaining herself to us. She's just talking. And we happen to be there, and what she says is exactly what she means. That's the goal. Always. Every room, every scene, every word. Saying exactly what you mean and making it sound like the most natural thing in the world. I haven't gotten there yet with this monologue. I'll know when I do because the room will change. Not literally. The room will still be cold, and the mirror will still be warped, and the radiator will still be doing its Tuesday thing. But something in the relationship between me and the words will shift, and it will feel less like performing and more like simply being the person who says these things. I live for that shift. Everything before it is work. The shift itself is why you do the work. Here is another genuinely funny thing about 1947. The rules. There are so many rules. I don't mean laws, though there are plenty of those too, and several of them are also funny in a horrifying way that I'll address in the special episode about what 1947 actually looks like from the outside. I mean the social rules, the unwritten architecture of how things are done and how things are not done, and what it means if you do the thing that is not done. For instance, a woman does not go to a bar alone. This is not a written rule. It is not posted. No one has handed me a pamphlet. But it is known collectively, the way certain things are known collectively. The way everyone knows which door is the right door before anyone says anything. A woman alone in a bar is making a statement. The statement is about her. It is not usually a statement she intended to make. It is simply the interpretation that arrives automatically, like mail that nobody asked for. I go to bars alone sometimes. I go to bars alone when I have had an audition that requires processing, and Elise is unavailable, and Jack is unreachable, and Manny's is closed, and I simply need to sit somewhere that isn't my apartment with something in my hand that costs a little and takes the edge off the day. I go to bars alone and I find a seat, and I sit in it, and I have my drink, and I read, or I think, or I watch. And if someone interprets this incorrectly, they're wrong. And occasionally I tell them so. The thing is, And this is the genuinely complicated thing. I understand the rules. I don't mean I agree with them. I don't mean I think they're right. I mean, I understand them in the sense that I understand the weather. It is a real force in my actual life, and I must navigate it. And navigation is not the same as agreement. There is a version of a woman who rails against every rule constantly, and I have enormous respect for that version. But she exhausts herself in ways that leave less energy for the actual work. And I am, first and last, a person who wants to do the actual work. So I navigate. I pick my battles. I go to bars alone when I need to, and I say what I say to the man who doesn't understand. And then I sit back down and finish my drink and read my script, and the evening proceeds. This does not mean it's fine. I want to be clear about that. Navigation is not agreement. The rules are not right just because I've learned to move around them. I know that. Clara Marsh knows that. I think you know it too. Let me tell you about the radio. The radio in 1947 is, I want to use the right word. It is the thing. It is the center of the living room in a way that I imagine the fireplace used to be. The warm point, the gathering point, the thing you orient yourself toward in the evenings. In my apartment, there is a radio on the shelf next to the window, and it is on for most of the hours I'm home, on at a volume that could be described as low company, not loud enough to prevent thought, present enough to prevent silence. Because silence, in a one-bedroom apartment on West 54th Street on a Tuesday evening, has a specific quality that I find I prefer to manage with low company. What comes out of the radio is music, first of all. The music of 1947 is, here I have no complaints, none, not one. If we are accounting for what 1947 has gotten entirely right, the music belongs at the top of the list. The jazz. The big bands, which have gotten smaller since the war because the economics changed, but which still exist and still do what they do, which is to take sound and make it into something that has no right to affect you as much as it does. The singers. There are singers right now who make the hair on your arms stand up. I won't try to describe them because description is not the point. The point is that you hear them and understand, immediately and without argument, why music exists. I know every word of more songs than I could count. I know them from hours and years of listening while I do other things, make the coffee, learn lines, move through the apartment doing the 1,000 small tasks of maintaining a life. The radio plays and I absorb without trying, and now the songs are in me, part of how I carry the years. Sometime I'll be 40, and I'll hear a song I learned in this apartment on a Tuesday in 1947, and the whole of right now will come back. The smell of the coffee and the cold of the room and the specific quality of this particular moment, and I'll know exactly where I was. That's what music does. That's why we keep making it. There's also news on the radio. The news is, it's a lot. 1947 has a lot of news. The world is reorganizing itself at a pace that even for someone paying close attention is hard to keep up with. The edges of things shifting and reforming, the map of the world being redrawn in real time. I listen to the news with the attention of someone who has lived through enough to know that the news, for all its immediacy, is only ever the surface of the thing. The actual thing is underneath, moving more slowly, arriving not as headlines, but as changed circumstances. I follow the news. I have opinions about the news. I do not perform my opinions about the news for people who haven't asked, which is a policy I developed in approximately 1943, when I made the mistake of sharing a political opinion at a party and spent the rest of the evening being talked at by men who disagreed. On the radio on Tuesday evenings, before the music gets going, there is sometimes a serial. A radio drama. Characters you've gotten to know over weeks and months. Plots that unfold across episodes like chapters in a book that reads itself to you while you sit in your own chair. I am not ashamed to say I have favorites. I am not ashamed to say that occasionally I have sat in this apartment on a Tuesday evening and felt, during a particularly good episode of a radio drama, that the characters in the box on my shelf were more vividly present to me than the actual people who live 2 floors up. This is a fact about storytelling that I find both wonderful and appropriately humbling. As an actress, I know that the story you put someone inside becomes real to them in ways that purely real things sometimes don't. That is the power and the responsibility. That is why Thursday matters. It's noon now. The radiator has finally decided to contribute. The room is warming up in stages. I can feel it moving from the direction of the radiator, the slow, territorial advance of warmth through cold air, which is, if you choose to think about it poetically, something like the advance of any good thing. Slow, not always noticeable until you suddenly notice it, best appreciated once it's arrived. I have 45 minutes left in the room before I need to be downstairs for the matinee setup. I'm going to use 30 of them on the monologue. Not because I've decided how I'm doing it, because I've decided to stop deciding how I'm doing it and just do it, which is the lesson that takes about 6 years to learn and that you have to relearn in small ways every time you encounter new material. You prepare, and then you step off the edge and stop preparing and just speak. And either the preparation catches you or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you figure out why and you go back and you prepare differently. The 32nd time you do this, and this is approximately my 32nd time with a significant piece of material, the falling feels less like falling. It feels more like stepping into water you know the temperature of. Still requires the step, still requires the breath, but you know the water. I know the water. Clara Marsh wrote a character who waits in a way she can't always identify, a woman who has the kind of patience that comes not from virtue, but from long practice, from having waited so long that the waiting has become indistinguishable from the rest of living. I understand that character from the inside. I understand her the way you understand weather you've been standing in. That's why the 30 minutes. That's why the cold room and the folding chair and the warped mirror and the radiator that took until noon. That's why all of it. I'm going to go find out if I've done enough preparation to step off the edge. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'm going to the village.